Thank you, Ram, for this very depressing lecture. But there is hope for us because you will give another lecture tomorrow where you will show us how to bend the curve and actually move to the green realm, to the left. And I do know we have actually all the means we need in order to stabilize the climate again, but we need to use them. And everybody should think also of this sort of metaphor Ram used, that we are sending our children and grandchildren on a plane which may crash, actually. If it's only 5%, that's too much, clearly. So I would like to invite questions from the floor now. So is there anybody who would like to start? Dan, please.
Ram, that was wonderfully depressing. So I just have a very short question for you, and that is I've been working in the IPCC now since the 1990s, and our internal statement has always been the people who know the most about each individual topic, be it forest fires, be it the thermal hail circulation, be it the health effects, those who know the most are the most worried, which is a horrific position to be in given the lags built into the IPCC. So one feature of your plane analogy that you didn't highlight is that we know there are a whole number of very scary nonlinearities in the system, like turning off the ocean circulation, which we don't even talk about yet, right? But this is about saying your airplane has another likelihood to lose both wings, and that could happen anytime. How do you think about communicating all of these stacked risks that we can't say the probability is X for the year 2018, but we know they're lurking there?
Should I answer each question?
It's
Yeah. Dan, it's a terrific question. I'll tell you, we have become a little bit afraid in the US to talk about uncertainties because uncertainties is assumed to know we are making errors. So I started this work with my students 2 years ago to say that I'm going to prove that the 5% probability has no chance of occurring. And we looked at the data of the sea ice retreating. That so-called feedback was 2 times stronger than what was in the models. And the other disturbing thing happening is that our whole planet is held at the cooler by clouds in the extratropical oceans. And we found those clouds are retreating, letting more sunlight. So I'm not even sure if that 6 degrees is 5% probability or 20% probability. But it is, almost impossible to talk about this for the fear the climate change has become so political, at least in the US. But fortunately, we have our Senate president here and then governor from Argentina and all that. We should have this exchange. So I mean, there are just, the deeper you work, you realize so many things you don't know. And it could take you, if it takes in the right direction, we are all happy. But if it goes in the wrong direction, there are even more nasty surprises waiting for us.
Thanks a lot. We will now have 5 interventions now. So let's first Sanchez Sorondo, the Chancellor, and then Professor Viana, and then we'll have another package of 3. So maybe we collect the 2 questions now, please.
I know, but what is the reason clear that we say this depends on the human activity and not, for example, for the sun or other things?
Maybe we collect the next question as well. So that is Professor Viana.
Well, thank you, Ram, for this fantastic and terrible news presentation, which seems to get worse every time we listen to a new piece of analysis. My question is about what I see as a communication failure. I think we have very eloquent data showing what you've shown us, but society is not listening to that. And I think probably the best example is in the United States, where you have some of the best science in the world, and society voted against that, right? But that's not unique of the US. I think it's more of a general problem. So my question to you is how to communicate this, and it has to be done differently. Maybe religious leaders can have a role, like Pope Francis has done already with encyclical Laudato Si, but maybe we should spend some time in designing a strategy, because currently, clearly, it's a failure. We are not being able to communicate to society that they're all boarding this airplane, and especially those who have no guilt, people who have no footprint, especially the poor, which are in the bottom of your pyramid in there, and they will suffer the most because they are the least resilient in many cases, in urban, especially urban poor. So I'd like to hear your opinion on this.
Okay. First is Marcelo's question. There has been this myth, which we are not able to put it away, is that you can explain everything by this solar variations in the sun's output. Remember the satellite I helped launch with NASA in 1983? That's the first satellite which put calibrated measurements of the sun's output as we receive. And then in addition to that, there's been a series of rocket launches of solar radiometers. And IPCC has analyzed thoroughly. And the solar does vary. It does increase slightly, but that is about 10 to 20 times smaller than the heat added by this 450 billion tons of blanket we have. So it's been measured, it has been published. So we are mostly 99% convinced solar by itself cannot explain this. Greenhouse gas is a dominant source. And you can ask, why did I say 99, not 100? In science, you can never be certain about anything. But the public have to accept that, Marcelo, but we are not able to mention it. Oh, and then come to the yes. You asked the perfect question. And I feel this is because of the meetings here, and I've seen how this church has become an agent of change in protecting the environment. I think bringing the faith leaders and then bringing the healthcare providers together, because people listen to them. When my doctor says, don't eat too much beef, I listen to him, or her. In fact, my doctor is here, cardiologist, Mimi Guarneri. So I think that is one of the proposals we want to make in this meeting. And I'd like to do one more example. Sitting behind you is Reverend Glenn Scorgi. He invited me to address evangelicals in San Diego. And I was shocked at that meeting how receptive people were to talk to a fellow scientist. And again, I didn't get any pushback. They were difficult questions. So I think I see an opening there to influence, to talk to the public in an apolitical forum about climate change.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Actually, this question, we thought a lot about it also during the last assembly of the Pontifical Academy. My personal view is actually what we have to warn people about the risks, but we also have to have a positive narrative, a narrative of modernization. But we have to explore that later. I have now a big problem that we have at least 10 people have raised their hands, and we have, some 7 minutes to go, something. I read out who was on my list, and please, I have to close that, and please try to be brief. So it's Senator De Leon. We have Professors Farah, Hescox, and Jeffrey Sachs. So these are the 4 questions I would like to take, and let's see whether we can do 1 or 2 more later on. But please be brief, and Ram, you have to swiftly answer to that. Senator, please.
Okay.
Somebody does not want you to speak up here.
Ram, I want to say a very powerful presentation. Thank you very much. It's very sobering as well. The question I have is, what do world leaders, presidents, prime ministers, head of states, of subnationals, as well as leaders of legislative bodies throughout the world, what is their reaction when they hear your presentation? The professor from Brazil, Viana, makes a very compelling argument, obviously well, because I truly believe that the issue of climate is now no longer scientific. We have enough empirical evidence that clearly suggests that we must do something now rather than later, because the catastrophic consequences that are looming on the near horizon that are actually happening in real time as we speak. But nonetheless, political leaders have yet to act, at least not some major players throughout the world. What is their reaction at a subnational as well as a national level when they see the empirical evidence that you have presented?
Let's take also the questions from Professor Farrar and Hescox, and then you will answer.
Just very brief.
Mr.
Very briefly,
Farrar,
because it builds on the last couple of comments, and that is, I do believe we've got to move away from this sense that this is your children and your grandchildren that are being affected. That is true. But throughout human public health, the ability to make change today for something that comes 50 or 60 years away, even if they're your own children, is a great challenge. So until we bring the arguments to impacts today on people, particularly in a more selfish world, potentially, then I think we will always be putting this off forever, and politicians will love to put it off forever.
So, Professor Hescox, please.
And I would actually echo that was my same comment, is that unless we make, and people like you who have the expertise can help define the problems, especially from a health point of view, even deeper today, you know, people constantly delay action. And so my presentation and what I would suggest is that we have to find in deep ways to communicate those current impacts.
Please, Ram. Quick answers.
I don't have access to world leaders. I think the only few I have is our Governor Jerry Brown and you and few others. I've always had nothing but the best response from them. When they hear from scientists directly, it has a big impact on them. But how do you do it to global leaders? I wouldn't know. Maybe John or Jeff Sachs can comment on it. But what I would say is that my own feeling is the leaders don't have the public support they need to take drastic actions. Why am I making this claim? I talk to anyone, even in my own university, very few who have really know or comprehend the urgency of this. That is, our emissions in the next 15 years is going to set the course. We walk right through that existential threat. So that urgency, I don't see that, even in the Paris. The urgency is in the papers written by Johan Rockstrom, and then John, and several of us. I've talked about this. You got to do it now. I'm thinking there's no public support. Of course, I'm jaded by what's happening in the US.
Okay. I know, so I have a problem, but let's see. I guess we should come back to these extremely important issues during the conference, and it will also be reflected by the declaration. So please don't be disappointed if there is not a lengthy response now. We will heed it definitely, so it's very important. I'd like to conclude now just two interventions because they were also. So it is Jeff Sachs who in a way has to respond to some of the things, and Carlo Ruppia, who gives us the honor to be with us and who has been always a driving force of these things debated at the Academy. So Jeffrey Sachs and Carlo Ruppia, and then I have to close the discussion.
Thank you. I'd like to say a word about how to be highly effective because of the urgency in public policy. And I don't think that we're as absolutely precise on that as we can be. First, it's extremely important to understand that there is a very extensive world process underway on exactly these issues. If we fail to interact with that, we miss the mark. The Paris Climate Agreement is an extremely important vehicle. We don't mention it almost at all in the discussion. This is a huge mistake. It's important to understand it. It's important to be able to intervene effectively in it. The agreement itself came about in part through not only spiritual intervention of Pope Francis, but direct intervention in many ways. This is very practical, and it's a mistake to believe it's not happening or why aren't they listening? There's a lot of listening going on. The question is how to make the processes more effective and faster. That's number one. In that regard, number two for me is that the scientists need to bring specific new information to bear. The general ideas about the dangers, the risks, and so forth are known, and that's why we have a universal agreement. But all the time there's updated information. It would be better to package the updates rather than to reiterate all of the existing known information. The updates are rather alarming in general. They point to acceleration, deeper impacts, and I would summarize the updates rather than always repeating the whole story. Number three, if you deal with policymakers day by day, which I do, the overwhelming fact is they don't know specifically what to do. So even if you tell people in responsibility you have to do X to curb carbon emissions, and I was in Kuala Lumpur with Malaysia's lead policymakers yesterday, and in Singapore yesterday afternoon. We have not done an adequate job, and here I especially mean the engineers, not the climatologists, but the engineers, on what are the practical paths for decarbonization, for example. This is highly technical. This is not moral, that aspect. It's technical. What are the specific things that should be done in Singapore? It's a tough question, by the way. I could go at length, but I won't. But this is true everywhere in the world. We need specific solutions because people actually want real electricity, not the theory of electricity, but actual electricity, and not to stop in the transition. Okay, the fourth point that I would emphasize is to understand who's fighting this. Because most of what we're saying is not opposed by most of society. It happens to be opposed by ExxonMobil, Chevron, Koch Industries, and some others. This is extremely important to understand. If we don't, we're preaching to the choir. We don't need to preach to the choir. We need to point the finger at those who are absolutely putting humanity at risk. Real finance, real power. Believe me, Donald Trump didn't think of pulling out of the Paris Agreement. He doesn't think of much. But he was told to pull out of the Paris Agreement by 22 Republican senators who are funded by Koch Industries. This is simple. This is not a general proposition. This is money on the table. So we should understand what this is about. Fifth is, as is the recommendation in the draft agreement, mobilizing ongoing learning and brainstorming in a multi-centered way is extremely important. And the sixth point is general public awareness is always important. But I don't feel, let me put it positively, we have to target at this point. The big battle on diplomacy was won, actually, because to have a universal agreement, 193 countries with specific targets, commitments, and processes is a huge victory. To not talk about it or recognize it for what it is a mistake, because there is no other way to have global progress but such agreements, and then to make them work. And so we need to focus now on the victories, the increments, the processes to drive this forward at an accelerated rate. And time is extraordinarily short. And because of inertia and resistance, we're likely to lose unless we're really consequent on how to win. And that means understanding now the real specifics of the battle.
Okay, so thanks a lot. This was a very long question, but it was a very good answer as well, so thanks a lot. So Ram, you don't have to do anything about that. So the last question is by Carlo Rubbia, please.
Can you hear me? It's okay. Fine. Well, I will use only 2 questions, not 6, and I'll make them very quick. First of all, it is quite clear that the main question we have a heading is associated with the presence of CO2. CO2 is the major element which is behind us. Millions and billions of tons have been produced. The question is, what are the practical ways to be able to correct, to modify the situation in the case of, for instance, CO2? I believe that the best solution is based on the use of natural gas. There is a huge amount of natural gas existent, and more to come with clathrates and others. And the question is, can we use natural gas in an acceptable way? The answer is extremely simple, and it's based on a development which we have been doing and which I'm working on, which is the idea of taking natural gas, which is CH4, and transform it into black carbon, which is a solid, plus hydrogen, which can be converted through various methods, for instance, into methanol and things like this to be used for transport. So therefore, this method is a perfectly legitimate method which costs a reasonable amount of money, and which can be used as an alternative to the standard burning of CO2 emissions. The second point regards the renewable energies. Renewable energies are very important. They have to be developed. Unfortunately, renewable energy are not everywhere. The renewable energy are only in the specific places. You can, if you want to renewable energy from the sun, you have to go to the Mediterranean, for instance, to the south. If you want wind, you have to go to the north. And therefore, there are long distances between the place in which the natural in which the renewable energy are produced and the place where most of the people are. Now, how do you connect the link, which is never typically a few thousand kilometers? For instance, in China, you have 3,000 kilometers between the wind and the population, and a few thousand kilometers between the sun and the population. And similar situation applies to Europe and to other countries. The solution, in my view, is the one of introducing superconductivity. Superconductivity is a method which allows one to transport a very large amount of energy. We are talking about gigawatts of energy over big distances with essentially very low energy loss, and with a very small, tiny devices which are very acceptable to the environment. So therefore, this seems to me a second line in which is worthwhile for us to develop. So one is for ordinary natural gas, the production without hydrogen production. And if without CO2 production, if there's no CO2 production, we can burn all the natural gas in the world without any shortcoming, any other difficulties. Why not using that? And the second alternative is to build a system which allows us to transport economically in an acceptable way large amount of gigawatt power over distances of thousands of kilometers. And for that, superconductivity is the way. These are the 2 points I would like to underline. Thank you very much.
No, thanks a lot, Carlos. So these are two exciting potential disruptive innovations, actually. We will come back to it certainly also tomorrow. But Ram, quick comment on that, please.
I agree with both the speakers, what they said.
So that was a very quick one, and this was also a very gracious way of responding.